Welcome back, Shawnee Mountains Garage. Sunday afternoon, I had a couple hours to spare. So I decided I was going to pop the 5.3 out of the 72 Nova and pop in the 6-liter that we just built in the last couple weeks. And then mock up the transmission. Pretty simple with a car with no front sheet metal. This is Tuesday afternoon, almost 5 o'clock. And I've successfully got it bolted in there. Here's the journey of what happened. I'll catch you at the end of it. I did a little bit of shuffling. I actually have clear floor under the 72 Nova. And I'm lowering out the dummy tranny. I usually jam a piece of 2x4. Sorry about the light flashing there, but between the engine and the firewall, when you don't have exhaust or anything to hold it up, that works pretty good. All right, next is the engine. When I set the engine in a month and a half ago, it was about 6 feet in the air and I was working on a ladder, doing it waist high with no front end. This is actually fun. Just working at a slow pace. I have no schedule. I'm going to simple green the frame and the firewall a little bit. It's just dusty. This motor's pretty clean. I'm going to take it apart someday. I'm actually going to peek in one of the spark plug holes, see if it's a 4.8 or a 5.3. I believe it's a 5.3. And I'm going to take the mounts off, take those off and not use them. Swap it over. I still need to make my freeze plug retainers for the heads for the 6-liter before I set it in. I'm not sure I'd have room to put them in afterwards. But I don't know without setting the engine in to see how much space I have. So we'll see. I gave the area around the engine the old Krylon touch. It's a satin black that's going to flatten out some, I think. I didn't do around the control arms because I still need to rebuild all that stuff. But if for some reason I don't pull the engine back out, which you never know, it might be in for good, then it's all painted in there. I painted the whole tranny tunnel and the floorboards and everything, so that's good to go. I swapped the mounts over with the new brackets, and as one long bolt goes all the way up into the engine, and the other ones are traditional LS swap style, so that should straighten out my 4.5 movement. And I went ahead and clear coated it from about here down, all the raw stuff, because I can't help myself. It'll prevent the heads of the bolts from rusting and stuff, at least slow it down. All right, so tomorrow morning I'll make the block off plates and probably set her in. Early Monday morning doing some cardboard aided design work. That came out okay. We'll call it adequate anyway. I thought about kind of sinking the holes, but really nothing to gain. If I need space between the firewall, which I don't think I do, I can still do that. But yeah, Loctited. I experimented with washers too, but I didn't like any of it, so I just Loctited the bolts and tightened her up. I think she'll be okay. I saved my templates for the front because of course they repeat. And I don't know about the accessories if they're going to be in the way, so I'll handle the front in the car. Now I think I'm going to lift using the combination of these 3 bolts on each side on the head, the big ones, and trying to find a way to lift it without scratching it. So that'll be next. And we'll stab it in. That hangs pretty well. Now we'll set her in. Well, now it's official. That monstrosity of a rack, I'll use it in something else. There's nothing wrong with the rack. It just doesn't work with an LS apparently. It's running right into the engine. It won't allow me to use my drain port. I can't even set the engine down on the mounts. It's hard into the engine. I didn't want to use it anyway. Now I don't have to worry about a power steering pump. I'll just put a manual box in it. I have all new linkage. And I'll use this on something else. And up here, I only have to worry about mounting an alternator. Life just got easier. All right, the steering rack is out of the way. That won't be a problem anymore. When I build mounts, I usually shim the oil pan with a piece of wood in the cross member and set the angle front and back. And I go ahead and build mounts. I'm happy with the engine fore and aft with this style mount. But the problem, and this is so typical, These are the small block stands I had bolted on the other frame, so I know they're correct. A small block Chevy or big block Chevy, bolts right in. With this junk, I'm a half a hole off. You can see where I've shaded it with the marker. Both sides. I mean, it's consistent, but half a hole either way. So I'm going to take the mounts off and elongate the hole in the mill. I could stop and build mounts, but I'm happy with everything else about these. They just missed by half a hole. It's pretty common for motor mounts to have, a pretty generous hole. In this case, they don't. They're pretty, I think they're 7/16 round. It won't hurt a thing to slot the hole. It's so typical. No such thing as a bolt-on pat. I run the end mill straight down, and then to make it an oval hole, I run both wheels at the same time to basically make it go diagonal. I mean, it goes X and Y, but I make it go that way. I go slow because it's easy to mess up. I had to pause for a few minutes while a buddy dropped off a transmission. I left the engine dangling. When I came back, it fell into place and put its own bolts in. Well, not really, but they fall right in now. I like the clearance. I believe I still have room behind the cross member for my steering, but I'll double check. Convenient, I can measure the linkage on that. Next, let's stick the transmission in. I stuck the SFI flex plate on with 2 bolts. This is the dished version with the spacer on this side, and I believe I'm going to run into spacing problems. So I just got 2 bolts hand tight. When I installed the transmission for the last time, I put a helicoil in this hole for 3/8 course, so I can use that hole to bolt the dipstick and the shield on. Got it strapped down to the jack. Always a good idea. You should always put a little oil in the torque converter, but it doesn't do you any good if you fill it laying on its back, and as soon as you flip it out, it runs out the hub. So I put some in and I gradually work it up to horizontal and let the fluid go down where it belongs. And when I can hold it horizontal and stick it in the transmission without it running out, it's ready to go in. In this case, I built the transmission and I know that I lubed the pump bushing and the front seal, so I don't need to put anything on the hub. If you didn't know, it's always a good idea to spread some Vaseline on there. In my case, it would be overkill. On GM transmissions, if you took a flat bar, held it across there and measured into the torque converter, if it's properly installed, it should be 1 inch from here to the back side of my parallel. I got about 1 1/16 inches. From the back of the block to outside the ring gear should be about 7/8, and I'm pretty much there. So the difference between the two should be my converter pullout. Bolted up to the engine, as expected, I have a gap that I could deal with if I could pull the torque converter ahead, but it's hung up on the hub. This combination, if you were to just shim that right now, you'd wipe out the pump and probably the thrust in the engine. I'm going to pull it off and machine the hub down, try to gain the clearance. Typical. No such thing as a bolt-on pat. Didn't I say that already? When companies build stall converters, there's some popular cores that they use. You can see this is the old converter pads where it used to bolt onto the flex plate. Then they weld this kit on. And this has an anti-ballooning plate, and they fix up the inside. And they know at a known torque how many RPMs it's going to stall to, and that's how they test it. It's like a fixed number, maybe like 300 foot-pounds. They know it's going to do X RPM. And on either side of that, they have a scale. They can pretty much figure out how it's going to perform. For the most part, it's still kind of a guess, but it's pretty close. And when they adapt all this stuff on, they have everything fall into a range of acceptability, dimension-wise. So last night, while I was still in the heat of the battle, I went ahead and cut 220 thousandths off my spacer. I should have taken a closer look at the hub. See how it drops off? Well, now that I can actually butt this up against the flex plate, I drop into that notch behind it because that isn't wide enough right there. That's not going to work. So I went inside and thought about it and went back to square one. Stock Turbo 400 dimensions. I got a straight edge across here. I just did it, imagine it. Measuring into the pad, 1 inch. Measuring to the end of the hub, 7/8. My torque converter, 1 inch to the pads, 3/4 to the hub, so I'm an 1/8 inch longer. Probably still fall into the acceptable range, but not as long as an LS. I'll show you one of those next. Out here in the shed, early morning, this is an LS hub. I'm still 1 inch back to the converter pads already measured. And I'm 3/8 back to the hub. So to recap, this would be instant death on my engine and transmission. This would have worked if my hub was flat, but it's not. So I'm not going to use either one of these. I'll have to get some short flex plate bolts because I won't be using that, which took longer bolts. And the only way this converter is working in my combination of parts is I'm going to build an extension on this and weld it on. Make it the same dimension as the LS converter. Then I won't need an adapter on the crank. I found a piece of magnetic steel. Machined the outside. I didn't have to cut it very much. Found a good use for this. I measured it first, but it's perfect. I bored the center, and I'm going to weld that center up to attach it, so it's semi-permanent anyway. And I have to cut it to length. I think I'm going to cut it a little bit long, probably just in the bandsaw, and then turn it around and face it off. I think that's my plan. I could pot it off in the other lathe, but I'll probably still end up having to face it, so I might as well just whack it off in the bandsaw. People seem to like it when I show my work. These dimensions apply only to my setup, but I'm currently 3/4 of an inch, 0.750, in from the face of the bell housing to the front of the hub. An LS specific torque converter would be 375 from the face of the bell housing to the end of the hub. That leaves me a difference of 375 thousandths. So I made my spacer 375. It looks good. Now I'll go try it on. Before I weld it on, I wanted to test the depth. So I left the new extended pilot sticking out of the crank a little bit, and I pushed the converter up against the flex plate, and this is where it stopped. And I have this much more headspace. So I think I'm good. I already can tell that I'm going to need to shim between the converter and the flex plate, so it'll probably end up riding out flush like this, but I'm in the range. I think it's going to work. Now time to weld it on. All welded on, I found another excellent use for this. It made a nice jig to line that up. You can hardly tell I did anything. I didn't want an LS specific converter, but now I have one. If that's the worst thing that can happen, I guess I can deal with it. I preferred it when it was just a traditional legacy spacing converter, but now it's LS specific. My flywheel is on and torqued with short bolts. So to recap, this is the dished flex plate, no adapter, short bolts. The converter mounting pad, which is approximately the ring gear to the back of the block, is 7/8 of an inch. From the face of the bell housing to the face of the torque converter pad is an inch. Mine's slightly more than an inch, but let's just call it an inch. From the face of the bell housing to my converter hub is now 3/8 of an inch. Other dimensions you'll find on the internet is from the face of the torque converter mounting pad to the end of the hub pilot on a stock TH400 converter is 200 thousandths. On an LS converter, it's 600 thousandths. There'd be that gap right there. There's that magical 400 thousandths that's missing on an LS crankshaft. The dimensions I showed you on the piece of paper that I used to make my spacer or my hub pilot extension were specific to this torque converter because my original hub that they had put on there was already too long So this had to be shorter than normal. A normal, if you could buy an LS extension weld on, which I don't know if you can or not, it should be about 400 thousandths. State of the transmission address. I probably told you the story, but a short version, the 71 Nova originally had a 204R in it before I got it. With all the parts that came with it, I got this 204R crossmember. And I happen to know, because I've swapped a few, that a Turbo 400 and a 204R share the same mounting location. I don't know who made this crossmember, but between the multiple sets of holes here and the generous slots here, I swear I can bolt anything in this, because I've moved the engine ahead an inch. Still lines right up. That's awesome. The shield only touches the floor in one tiny little spot up there. I mean, the size of my thumb. That's awesome. I have a pretty big gap on my converter, but I can shove it all the way up to the flex plate if I wanted to. Clearly, I don't. An excellent way to measure the gap is to use a drill bit. That's a 1/4 inch drill bit. I want to favor the 1/8 pullout of the pump, giving the torque converter and the flex plate that much more room to do their flexing before they actually push on the crankshaft of the engine. Given the choice, pump gears and another pump are a lot cheaper than a crankshaft and everything else. Most GM Performance torque converters take a 7/16 bolt instead of the 3/8 that the factory came with. That's the case here, so I need to come up with 3 1/8 thick 7/16 ID washers or shims. It's also clear to me the only way to put in a converter bolt is to take the starter back out. No big deal. But I'm happy with my engine placement. On the LS with that cylinder head, even with the bell housing, it does raise the dickens with dipsticks that weren't designed to have the cylinder head this far back. But I'll get around that by some gentle bending. You need 3 inches for my steering linkage. This is about 4 1/4. Shouldn't be an issue there. The pan is just slightly below the cross member and on the same plane as the deep pan on the 400. And I'll be able to use my turbo drains, probably not with a 90-degree fitting, but a 45 anyway. So what did we really learn? Don't trust anything or anybody, regardless of what it says it'll fit. When I unboxed the torque converter that I just put in the Nova, flipped it upside down on the bench, and my 4L80E spacer and flex plate wouldn't sit down on the pads, I knew it was wrong. I wasn't sure how I was going to fix it exactly, but clearly something was wrong. My new SFI dish flex plate with this wasn't any better. Same problem. While they probably made that torque converter to a spec, they were a little bit fat here and there, and the way it's shaped around the hub didn't help. Because again, that's like a front-wheel drive converter that they convert over to a V8 Chevy application. My best advice, if you want to try using one of these in your dish flex plate, is to put it all on the back of the engine, put the converter up, and hopefully it touches at least the flex plate. But line this with grease and make sure there's a witness mark and you still have 1/8 of an inch before you hit that step right there. Because it's possible that you can put the converter up and it'll touch the flex plate, but you're just about to hit that and the flex plate can't move. What we just accomplished in my Nova, I have a lot of room for that thing to flex back and forth and not hurt a thing. When I started this process Sunday, I was just poking around on a Sunday afternoon. I did some cleaning. I was feeling pretty good, just kind of ho-humming around. Here we are, a couple days later. I've completely devastated the shop trying to fix this problem. I've used just about every tool I have, but that's what it's all about. So that's it for now. Like, share, subscribe. Next, we're going to do more work on something, and I'll catch you later.